I used to believe that if you worked hard, stayed loyal, and kept your head down, good things would follow. That belief carried me through long nights, missed birthdays, and a career I was proud of. But one meeting changed everything, and not in the way I expected. This is not just a story about losing a job. It is about betrayal hiding behind polished smiles, about power used to silence truth, and about what happens when secrets think they are safe. I did not set out to destroy anyone. I only refused to disappear quietly. What followed was not revenge fueled by anger, but justice guided by patience. And sometimes that kind of ending hits harder than anyone expects. I never thought my life would split into a before and after because of a 10-minute meeting, but that morning still plays in my head like a loop I cannot turn off. I arrived early, coffee in hand, confident in the numbers I had finalized the night before. The merger was everything we had worked toward for 2 years. $1 billion, headlines, promotions. I was a senior analyst, trusted with sensitive data, and I believed I mattered. When Claire's assistant emailed me asking to come by her office, I assumed it was about projections. I even smiled on the elevator up. Claire sat behind her desk, calm and polished, her hair perfectly smooth. She did not invite me to sit. She slid a white envelope toward me and said, "This is a business decision." I laughed nervously and said, "What are you talking about?" She replied, "We are restructuring." I asked, "Restructuring what exactly?" She said, "Your position." I said, "My performance reviews are excellent." She answered, "This is not personal." I whispered, "It feels personal." She looked at the clock and said, "Please read the letter." My hands shook as I opened it. Termination, effective immediately. No warning, no discussion. I felt heat rush to my face. I asked, "Is this because of budget cuts?" She said, "That is all I can say." I asked, "Did I do something wrong?" She replied, "Security will escort you out." Security. That word stung worse than the firing itself. As I stood up, I noticed she would not meet my eyes. I wanted to scream, but instead I nodded and walked out with my dignity barely intact. My coworkers stared as I packed my desk. Some avoided eye contact. One whispered, "I'm so sorry." I kept thinking there had to be a mistake. What Claire did not know was that the real story started a week earlier. I had stayed late finishing a model after a system outage. When I returned to grab my coat, I heard voices in the conference room. The lights were low. I recognized Claire's laugh instantly. Then I heard Mark, our married CFO, speaking softly. Through the glass, I saw them standing too close. Her hand rested on his arm, his tie was loose. When they noticed me, Claire's face hardened in a way I had never seen. She said, "This is not what it looks like." Mark said, "You should not be here." I said, "I was just leaving." Claire said, "Good." From that moment on, everything shifted. I was removed from meetings, my access was limited, emails went unanswered. I told myself I was imagining things, I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but deep down I knew. The affair was real and it was dangerous. Not because of gossip, but because decisions were being made based on loyalty instead of logic. Back in the present, carrying a box of my belongings to my car, humiliation burned through me. I felt disposable. I sat in the driver's seat and cried until my chest hurt. I had given everything to that company, I had protected their secrets, and now I was nothing. At home, the silence was unbearable. I replayed every interaction with Claire over the last month. The tension, the coldness, the timing, then it hit me. I was fired because I had seen something I was not supposed to see. I was a risk, and they erased me. That night, I opened my laptop, not knowing that this was the moment my story stopped being about loss and started becoming something else entirely. The anger did not arrive all at once, and that almost scared me more than if it had. For the first few days after being fired, I moved through my apartment like a ghost, answering calls I did not want to take and ignoring emails that reminded me of everything I had lost. People kept saying things like, "You'll land on your feet," and "It's their loss," but those words felt hollow. What they did not understand was that I was not just grieving a job. I was grieving trust. I had believed in the system, in rules, in fairness, and now all of that felt like a lie. One night, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop with no clear purpose. I told myself I was just organizing files, closing chapters. That was when I saw the folder labeled Backup. I had created it months earlier during a system migration, forwarding key emails to my personal account in case anything went wrong. At the time, it felt responsible, maybe a little paranoid. Now it felt like fate. As I clicked through the files, my chest tightened. Financial projections, risk assessments. Internal warnings that had been flagged and then quietly ignored. Then I saw the emails between Claire and Mark. They were not explicit, but they did not need to be. The tone was intimate, familiar, careless. Late-night messages, private jokes, decisions discussed outside official channels. One message from Mark read, "I trust you more than anyone else on this deal." Another from Claire said, "We'll make it work no matter what the analysts say." I was one of those analysts. I had raised concerns about inflated projections weeks earlier, only to be brushed aside. I whispered to myself, this isn't just an affair. I said it again louder. This isn't just personal. The more I read, the clearer it became. Their relationship was influencing the merger in ways that could hurt shareholders, employees, everyone. Risks were minimized. Numbers were adjusted, warnings were softened. I felt sick. The betrayal went deeper than I imagined. They had not just betrayed their partners or their marriage vows. They had betrayed the company and everyone who trusted them. I called my friend Jenna, who had worked in compliance at another firm. When she answered, she said, "You sound shaken." I said, "I think I found something bad." She asked, "Bad how?" I replied, "Career-ending bad. Possibly criminal." She paused and said, "You need to be careful." Careful. That word followed me for days. I knew enough to understand the danger of what I was holding. Powerful people do not like being exposed, but I also knew what silence had already cost me. I had been fired without cause, erased to protect their secret. The idea of letting them walk away clean felt unbearable. I decided to request a meeting with Claire. I told her I wanted closure, nothing more. To my surprise, she agreed. When I walked into her office days later, it looked exactly the same, as if nothing had changed. She gestured to the chair and said, "Make it quick." I said, "Why was I really fired?" She replied, "We've been over this." I said, "No, we haven't." I told her what I had seen that night. I watched her expression carefully. She did not deny it. She leaned back and said, "You misunderstood." I answered, "I didn't." She sighed and said, "Even if you're right, it's not your concern." I asked, "Is the merger being compromised?" She smiled and said, "You should focus on finding a new job." That smile chilled me. I leaned forward and said, "I have copies of emails." Her eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't," I said, "but I do." The room went quiet. Finally, she stood and said, "If you know what's good for you, you'll keep this to yourself." I asked, "Is that a threat?" She replied, "It's advice." I walked out of that office with my hands steady and my mind clear. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. That conversation flipped something inside me. I was done being scared. I was done protecting people who would not hesitate to destroy me. I understood then that the truth had weight, and I was the one holding it. That night, I made a decision that would change everything, even though I did not yet know how far the consequences would reach. I did not rush after that meeting, even though every part of me wanted to. That patience was not confidence, it was survival. I knew enough to understand that if I moved too fast or spoke to the wrong person, Claire and Mark could bury me all over again. So instead of acting on emotion, I acted on structure. I made copies of everything and organized the timeline. Dates, decisions, warnings ignored, projections changed. Patterns mattered more than accusations. The first call I made was to a lawyer Jenna recommended, someone who specialized in corporate ethics. When I sat in his office, I said, "I don't want revenge." He looked at me and said, "Most people say that." I replied, "I want the truth to be seen." He nodded and said, "That's usually more dangerous." He advised me to avoid direct confrontation and suggested I approach the acquiring company's ethics committee as a former employee raising concerns. "Frame it as risk, not betrayal," he said. "Let them connect the dots." That advice saved me. I reached out quietly, presenting myself as someone worried about governance issues tied to the merger. I shared only what was necessary at first, enough to raise questions, enough to make them look closer. What I did not expect was the response. The ethics advisor told me, "You're not the first person to notice inconsistencies." I froze and said, "What do you mean?" She said, "There were already concerns. Yours just clarified them." That was the twist. I had believed I was alone, carrying a secret no one else saw, but cracks had already formed. My evidence did not start the fire. It poured gasoline on something already smoldering. An internal investigation began quietly. No announcements, no emails, just delays, meetings postponed, requests for additional documentation. From the outside, it looked like normal corporate hesitation, but I knew better. Claire knew something was wrong too. She called me one evening, her voice lighter than it should have been. She said, "Have you said anything?" I replied, "No." She laughed and said, "Good, I knew I could trust you." I said, "I hope so." She said, "Everything will be fine." The irony almost made me laugh. Over the next few weeks, the merger timeline slipped further. Analysts whispered. Executives grew tense. I watched from a distance, reading industry news and waiting. I did not celebrate. I stayed cautious. Powerful people fight hardest when cornered. Then one Friday afternoon, a former coworker texted me. "Mark just got walked out." I stared at my phone and asked, "Are you serious?" She replied, "Security, boxes, the whole thing." My hands shook as I sat down. This was no longer quiet. This was public. Rumors exploded, the stock dipped. Official statements spoke of temporary leave, but everyone knew what it meant. Claire went silent, no calls, no messages. I realized then that this was not damage control. This was collapse in motion. I did not feel joy, I felt a strange calm. The truth was moving on its own now, and there was no stopping it. And I knew, deep down, that Claire would not escape what was coming next. The official announcement came on a Tuesday morning, buried under careful language and polished statements, but everyone understood what it meant. The merger was cancelled. The words used were unsalvageable due to governance concerns, which sounded clean and technical, but behind them was chaos. Careers ended, stockholders panicked, departments froze hiring overnight. The billion-dollar deal that had been treated like destiny was suddenly untouchable. When I read the news, I sat very still, letting it sink in. This was real. It had actually happened. Claire resigned 2 days later, not fired. Resigned, that detail mattered to her, I'm sure, control to the very end. A former coworker called me and said she cleared out her office before anyone arrived. I asked, did she say anything? They replied, just that people disappoint you eventually. Mark's fall was louder. His separation became public. His board memberships vanished. His name disappeared from future press releases. The man who once spoke with absolute certainty now avoided cameras. Watching it all, I felt no thrill, no rush, just a quiet sense of balance returning. Then something unexpected happened. I got a call from HR under the new interim leadership. They said, we'd like to discuss reinstating your position. I asked, why now? They replied, we owe you an apology. I thanked them and declined. I had already accepted a role at another firm, one that asked hard questions and welcomed them. When I told Jenna, she said, you chose yourself. She was right. Losing my job had felt like the worst betrayal of my life, but it forced me to stop shrinking for people who benefited from my silence. Claire did not destroy the merger because she fired me. She destroyed it because she believed power meant protection. I learned that telling the truth does not always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like patience, documentation, and knowing when to step aside. Karma did not scream. It whispered, then signed the paperwork. And I walked forward lighter, knowing I had not become what hurt me. If you're listening to this and wondering whether speaking up is worth the risk, I won't pretend it's easy. It cost me sleep, security, and the illusion that doing your job well is always enough. But silence has a cost too, and sometimes it's higher than we realize. This story was never about revenge. It was about refusing to disappear quietly for someone else's comfort. Power built on secrets always cracks eventually. The truth doesn't need force. It just needs time and the courage of one person willing to hold it. If you've ever been pushed aside for knowing too much or standing firm, remember this. Walking away with your integrity intact is not losing. It's the beginning of something better.